Psychoanalysis and Spirituality, Dasha Mahavidya, Chinnamasta. Journey of the Dasha Mahavidya brings us now to the fifth and the most difficult of all Mahavidyas, Chinnamasta. Chinnamasta is most difficult to visually see also, and in operational practice, obviously it is the most difficult because it goes to the root of our psychospiritual problems. And obviously, to turn something over at the very root of a giant edifice is something very difficult. Chinnamasta, in a way, is the second pole of a spectrum if we look at Tripura Sundari as the goddess of desire and Chinnamasta as the ending of all desires. Let's go into the story of origin and then we get deeper into it. The story of origin goes as this. Parvati, with two of her friends, has gone to take bath. She comes back having taken the bath, and the two friends complain of feeling hungry and needing nourishment right then and there. Parvati asks both of them to have patience and get what they want once they reach home, but the two insist on satiation, the quenching of desire, right then and there. Parvati then severs her own head and three streams of blood come out of her neck. One stream goes into the mouth of one friend, second into the mouth of another friend, and the third goes into her own mouth that is severed now. And this depiction obviously is very dramatic, very moving, very disturbing, and deeply conveying. The depiction is the Devi is holding her own severed head in one hand. Two friends are standing one on each side, and all the three are drinking blood, three streams of blood oozing out of the Devi herself. Importantly, she is drinking her own blood along with her friends. It is not somebody else's blood that she is drinking. Quite contrary to the first two Devis, Kali and Tara, where they seem to be drinking somebody else's blood. You have the garland of skulls again here, which you don't find in Tripura Sundari or Bhuvaneshwari. And Chinnamasta is standing on a couple making love with great sexual appeal. It's one of the most difficult sadhanas to do of all the Mahavidyas, and therefore has been put in the middle so that adequate preparation can be done in going through other Mahavidyas before one comes to this very difficult Mahavidya. I haven't seen any school that puts this Mahavidya in the first two, even not the left-hand schools. I'm not sure, but there can be possibly some schools who would put this Mahavidya as the second last, given the difficulty, and then round off the whole sadhana by a positive, benign Devi like Kamala towards the end of the entire process. Obviously, in this Mahavidya, one cannot take things literally. It would be stupid to do it. It is not a question of cutting off one's own head or the head of an animal. What is depicted and what is the purpose of this Mahavidya is to kill the ahankara or identification. One of the functions of the ego is of identifying with one's body and one's image. And there is this whole idea of doership, that I am doing something and therefore it has to beget good results. And this is one of the most difficult things to overcome, the overcoming of one's ego, which has a range of meanings from arrogance to a self-esteem, to desire for power, to desire for pleasure, to doership of things, to identification. And the most important is identification with this psychobiological system. How to disentangle the pure observer from identification with this psychobiological system and give up not only the identification, but along with it, the whole idea of doership, desire, and rewards. And even the benign desire to make the world a better place or make somebody else's life a better life, or even to realize spiritual goals. Sri Aurobindo writes, when he was passing through exactly the same point in his sadhana, he does not use the Dasham Mahavidya approach, but he uses the integral yoga approach. But the point through which Sri Aurobindo passed and the point at which Chinnamasta sadhana focuses on, Sri Aurobindo did pass through that point, and he writes something how he overcome that difficulty. And he writes in a poetic form. He says, he plucked desire with their bleeding roots. He annulled himself that God can be. So the last ounce of identification, the last ounce of desire, very sticky and difficult to disentangle from. Sri Aurobindo overcame that by a very strong act of enlightened will. And he describes that in this couplet. And this obviously is very difficult to do. Roll back identification with the psychobiological system and all the purposes of this psychobiological system. And that is what Chinnamasta sadhana is all about. The Bija mantra is read. We are told in tradition that this sadhana brings about very strong and intense powers. It is resorted to solve most difficult of problems which are not possible to solve otherwise. And it is a practice of being conscious, extremely aware, but not having the identification and doership. There is awareness, but no identification and doership. And therefore, equidistance from the pleasant or unpleasant consequences of action or non-action. So there is inaction, a comfort with non-action, or there is inaction in action. So either there is comfort with non-action, that you keep observing the desires, you keep observing the identification, and you are in a state of non-action, but in a state of high awareness and bliss. Initially, it would be very stressful high awareness, not necessarily bliss, but over a period of time, it will turn there. So either it is high awareness non-action and non-identification, or there is action but a poise of inaction because there is no doership and there is no identification with the psychobiological system uh, in the flavor of investment of the self. The consciousness is withdrawn from the identification process, and I is seen as separate from thoughts, emotions, and the entire nature at work, which works in the psychobiological system, even constitutes the psychobiological system. So it is a classical Sankhya state, a Sankhya station of Purush versus Prakriti, where you get into the Purusha, but the Purusha is withdrawn from the identification with the ego. And what remains is the pure witness. And the witness does not allow oneself to get identified with the self-image or the identification with the psychobiological system. The self goes away, the psychological self goes away, the identification with the biological self goes away, and therefore the fears of the psychological self and the biological self also go away. And the courage is something which is found by default. So courage is not developed here by practice. It is the opposite of courage. The fear arising from identification and desire, they are overcome. And the courage is found as something left behind by this process. Psychoanalytically, how do we see it? Where are the points of discussion? Very important in psychoanalysis is insight, and we have intellectual insight and transformational insight, and we have the healing insight, which is a very important process of healing. So in psychoanalysis, it's very important, this whole process of generation of insight, which may be intellectual, transformational, or healing. An important element here for discussion is, in psychoanalysis, we always talk about healing with I always being there, occasionally strengthened. But this is a process where the I is eroded, I is weakened, and the healing happens more in a situation of no self or weakened self. And therefore, the difficulty here is of the definition of the self, because we are not using the word self in the sense of Jung or Kohut or Winnicott. We are using the word in a separate sense. So the normal state where we are completely identified with the psychobiological system, and we don't have an observer separately observing the psychobiological system, if that state we designate as the state of the involved self, then we have to define a counterpart of it, a state of detached self or an observational self. And in that state of observational self, the involved self, whatever the entities are there in that involved self, they get weakened. Whether it's a unconscious ego or the social ego or identification or doership, all these functions get weakened and the observing self strengthens. So observing self strengthens, all other parts of the self weaken. And in that state, healing is facilitated. So this is a very different approach to healing, where it is healing not by strengthening of the ego, but by removing the presence of the ego in the complexes and weakening the ego, whereby ego no longer has too many desires and therefore too many fears of something coming from inside or outside. There is also a mystical dimension of, once the ordinary identifications weaken and recede, and the station of awareness increases, certain mystical processes happen, certain mystical energies coming. That is what we are told in literature. One doesn't have to believe without experience, but this is what we are told in literature, that certain healing energies and suprahuman beings, they help in that healing process. Even if you keep the belief part aside, the important point is that in the spiritual schools, there is an approach of healing where we don't strengthen the ego, we weaken the ego, we strengthen the observer, we strengthen the desire of healing, and we slowly withdraw the strength of the ego from the complexes and from the desires. There is another way of healing, the third way, which Aurobindo puts forward. It is aspiration, rejection, and surrender. So first, one needs to have an aspiration to be healed or for self-development, whatever be the objective. Then reject all those things which come in the way. This is neither repression nor suppression. It's a very different psychological process of observation, stepping back, and rejection. And one surrenders to God or to nature or to suprahuman entities for healing. And this is a very different way. It's a spiritual approach to healing. One of the spiritual approaches to healing. And the core of the entire thing is about observation. How do you create an observer? How do you split your mind such that there is an observer and it observes all the thoughts and emotions rising and falling? And initially, these rising and falling thoughts and emotions overwhelm the observer, and the observer is not able to maintain itself for a long time. Slowly, it's able to. And when that happens, there is a distance created between all the cognitive and affective events, and what is being observed undergoes usually a sinusoidal wave, increases in intensity, and then goes away forever. So it's a very different, these are two different routes. The route of observation, what is called Sakshi Bhav in Hindu psychophilosophy, is a master technique of Hindu philosophy. Almost the entire Eastern spirituality. This is the core of, I don't know how many, it's almost countless number of spiritual schools and techniques, where just keep observing whatever rises and falls in the mind, and slowly that goes away and a blank mind remains and healing happens. In fact, it is the healing that happens first and then the blank mind remains. It's a master technique. So it's a master technique of spirituality, just as healing, insight, and catharsis are like two master techniques of psychoanalysis. Similarly, in spirituality, the master technique is of observation, being just a witness. Krishnamurti calls it choiceless self-awareness. Sri Aurobindo puts up a different method of aspiration, rejection, and surrender. In this Mahavidya, all of this is involved. Insight generation related to identification, related to doership, related to desire, that insight generation happens. Aspiration, rejection, surrender definitely happen. Observation definitely has to be used as a master technique. And as the visual depicts, enlightened aggression is used to cut the hold of libido and aggression on one's free observing witness. So instead of taming the aggression, aggression is put to use for freedom. And the weakening of identification and doership results in slow disentanglement from trauma, weakness, narcissism, disintegration. This is like, it's a very interesting point. If there is affect bottled up related to an event, the question is catharsis the only way out? And the usual answer is yes, that once affect is generated and cannot be expressed or sublimated and is creating a symptom, the only way out is catharsis. But if we look at the cognitive approach, there is one more possibility. And the possibility is through thought, the generated affect can be degenerated. There is a reverse generation or an erosion. There is an erosion of affect. And this erosion happens. It's almost like erasing of affect. But it's more like a reverse generation. It's the ungeneration of affect. When a cognitive insight happens. And this is one more way of healing, of releasing affect, that the bottled up affect is not catharted out. The bottled up affect just gets erased because of degeneration or reverse generation. It's almost like the bottled up affect dissolves into the undifferentiated pool of affect from where it had come into this complex in the first place and then got trapped there. Because the cognitive idea which was holding it there, that undergoes a change and therefore that affect is released. So the emptying out of bottled up affect can be done by catharsis, also by reverse generation or dissolution into the matrix, into the common pool of affect. So withdrawal of identification can also bring about a similar situation of so we were on withdrawal of identification as one more route of releasing of the bottled up affect. Not releasing in the cathartic sense, but dissolution of the bottled up affect. And this is coupled with observation. The whole exercise here is from I to transcendence. So, of course, this can be done only after the I has been well formed. There is adequate cohesion. So we are not looking at fragile self to jump into this. So for the fragile self, first has to move into a strong self and then into the sadhana of Chinnamasta, where there is transcendence, annihilation, that is different. Like here we are talking about transcendence. It is a transcendence of I. It is not disintegration of I in the usual sense of annihilation, which is what we see in the Western paradigm, that either you have I or the annihilation of I. The transcendence of I is not in the Western paradigm, but definitely in the Eastern paradigm. In fact, in the West also we find echoes of this in Winnicott when he talks about organizing and disorganizing and unorganized. So he talks about a state of organizing of a strong I, unorganizing, where there is a momentary stepping back from that I to allow creative activity, and disorganizing, which is a disintegration of I. So similarly, here we can have a strong I, disintegration, which you can term as annihilation of I or destruction of I, and a transcendence of I. It is not the same as Winnicott's unorganizing, but it has a different spiritual angle to it. You transcend the ordinary identified I with an observer position. And this brings in an important element of limits of human transformation. What all is possible? What is the limit of human potential? What is the limit of human transformation? And there is a fundamental difference between East and West. The whole idea of transcendence, of freedom from cognition and affect, is an Eastern idea, not usually accepted as feasible or reasonable in the Western paradigm. So here, the movement is initially in the childhood, we get into the situation of first we get into this oceanic oneness, then the idea of I and not I, and then freedom from I, and that comes from, you can do a lot of practices for freedom from I in many different ways. You can look at difficulties of I in terms of power elemental, attachment elemental, weakness elemental, I am not good enough elemental. And lastly, the most difficult part is freedom from identification with the psychobiological system. That will cut at the very root of pathology and also desire. So here the whole goal is freedom from instincts, freedom from drives, freedom from elementals, and managing them. If not, freedom is not possible. Optimize and not capture, not control, optimize, master, and manage. And all of it can happen as it's depicted in the visual only when the two fundamental forces of aggression and libido standing on each side of the individual, both of them are saturated to the last constituent of them in a very elemental sense, with a desire for enlightenment then and there. They cannot wait. When this kind of a complete saturation of the fundamental drives happens with the desire for freedom and enlightenment, that this great achievement of freedom from identification can be done. I think is a mistake. I think the Bija mantra is Om. So it's one of the most subtle and most difficult of Mahavidyas to conceptually understand and operationally practice, requires a really good guru or somebody very deep in the area of psychology to really guide this practice of this. Thank you.